Welcome to the Good Old Blades podcast. I am your host, Aaron Levere, and join me as we talk to other knife makers and craftsmen about anything and everything knives. Point blank, Shawn Shropshire is a cool dude. If it wasn't for the Oklahoma Knife Group, I probably would have less experience in his work and his personality. But that's the great part of knife groups and associations. They sometimes bring together unlikely characters and strengthen the bond of us in this conglomerate we know as knife making. Shawn has spent the last 20 plus years making knives and makes some of the raddest frontier-style knives and sheaths out there. He started the Wandering Bladesmith with Deke Parker to showcase knives around the world, and as president of the OKG, he and a magnanimous group of volunteer board members and associates push the show, shop meets, and other activities in the greater Oklahoma area and adjoining states. What can one really say about a person's knives without digging into them as people? This episode isn't enough to cover Shawn. He's larger than life. But I really think you'll understand why his charisma and passion drive his work in knives. And Shawn, it's good to have you on the Good Old Blades podcast.
Thanks for having me. Looking forward to it.
Yeah, absolutely. The impetus for this interview obviously is to get to know you better as a craftsman and everything, but kind of a dual purpose is to also explain and to highlight some of the work that the Oklahoma Knife Group has been doing with knife making in the region and whatnot. And so first, I think I'd like to spend some time getting to know you and your craftsmanship and whatnot, and talk through some of your Forged and Fire experience and whatnot. And then after that, we can start talking a little bit more about the Oklahoma Knife Group and kind of what makes that special.
Sounds good to me.
Yeah. So what got you into knife making, and kind of can you explain a little bit about the journey from start to where you're at right now inside of knives?
Yes, definitely. So it's interesting. I was asked this question earlier today also. How did you get started in knife making? And I was with another maker, and we both kind of looked at each other, and it's like, well, I'm not sure how to answer that. But I think it all started with the very first pocket knife my father bought me. He was a career Army, and we were at the Shopette, which is the military version of like a 7-Eleven. And they had a small knockoff of the Swiss Army knife with the white celluloid handle. And I actually still have that knife. And from the time I got that, I was just fascinated with knives. Years and years later, I loved art all through school, but making a living as an artist is not a very easy thing to do. And so I ended up in another career. And while I was there, I met someone else who made knives. Started out like a lot of people, buying a pre-made knife blank, putting a handle on it, enjoyed that, and then eventually progressed to the point I'm at now, thanks to the help of a lot of makers. Probably, if I had to say how long I've been making knives, I would guess around 20 years, but there's no specific date that I can say this is when I started.
That makes sense. It's interesting to me because our generation of knife makers now pull from early influences like our grandfathers or fathers or whatever had some type of collection. There's usually some familial tie or something to do with Boy Scouts and whatnot. Like, but it kind of interests me. Like, a lot of people of our generations had exposure to knives, but not all of them turned into knife makers. Do you think, like, what drove you? Like, I mean, is there anything specifically other than just a general interest that really, I don't know, sparked that flame for you?
Well, my entire childhood growing up, and still, I mean, I love everything outdoors: hunting, fishing, camping, hiking, all of it. And the knife is just a basic tool for all of that. And I think all of us, every time we use any type of tool, whether it's a knife, a firearm, a hammer, a screwdriver, there's always something you wish was just a little bit better or a little bit different or suited better to your personal uses. Uh, and through that, you get what you think is a great knife, and you use it a few times. It's like, this would be just a little bit better if I could make this different or that different. And so I think that influences it some. And you were talking about our generations. Uh, my grandfather uh, he was a roofer for 45 or 50 years, and always had an old timer pocket knife. Uh, Sometimes he swapped it out for a Schrade, but it was sharpened with a sandstone rock that he got out of the driveway that he'd grind flat. And watching him with that, uh, butchering animals, using it on the farm, using it as a tool, uh, you always look up to those people and you want to emulate that to some extent. Uh, so I think there's that connection with it. It's something that a lot of us used a lot more than many others, and that might have something to do with why we ended up making rather than just buying. And I also think that for a lot of us, especially if you do forging, need a tool, make a tool. If we need a specific tool in the shop and it's not easily available or readily available, we just make one. And so that's similar with knives. If we have an appropriate piece of steel and I need a knife, well, it just seems logical to go ahead and make one if I have the materials to do it. And so I think that's why a lot of us ended up uh, making the knives or tools that we needed. And then some people progress beyond that and have that artistic inclination. They want to create things. They want to build something that's not just pure tool, but also has some artistic influence or design elements that we enjoy.
Yeah, I agree because I'd used knives for forever, much like you. And one time, well, it was kind of like uh, the paradigm shift for me was I'd hunted a lot and I was always used to crappy knives, and I could maybe skin an animal or something like that, and then the thing would be dull. Sometimes like field dressing something, and it kind of got to a point where the straw that broke the camel's back. I was in South Texas hunting nilgai on a Texas draw hunt, and those things are pretty big. I mean, I had a small cow's size nilgai, and I think I was sitting there instead of enjoying the process of cleaning my own game. I had two buddies that I was hunting with that also drew, and they were cleaning the nilgai, and I was the one that was the most efficient at sharpening knives. So I was sharpening their knives while they were cleaning my nilgai, and I was like, we're done with
Mm,
this. Like, I'm either gonna buy something
yeah.
real nice or make something. And I made the foolish decision to start making knives because I could have had hundreds of knives in my collection by now from really great knife makers if I would have decided to invest in buying versus building. But I've enjoyed the journey.
It's absolutely what we invest in tools and time could certainly purchase more, but there's that self satisfaction of learning the skill, creating. Uh, I, I tell people I'm a terrible businessman, but I have to sell knives to be able to make more knives, and it's the creative process for me that's the most fun. Getting to design something, build something. Uh, when someone calls me and says, "Hey, I want to buy a knife for my husband," they think it's a simple question. Do you have a knife for sale? And then I start asking, okay, what does he do? What is he going to do with the knife? Does he hunt? Does he fish? Does he hike? Boating, saltwater, freshwater, right-handed, left-handed, and I often get the kind of blank stare. Well, I didn't know I needed to know all of that. It's like, well, I mean, you can buy a simple knife and not have to answer any of those questions, but I want to make something that he's going to enjoy or that she's going to enjoy for years to come. It's not just going to end up sitting on a shelf. Uh, you were mentioning that nilgai hunt. That's been one of my dream hunts for years. I would love to get to do that, but that's a large animal, and with a tough hide. Uh, a similar experience as wild hogs. We have a lot of wild hogs, Oklahoma, Texas, in the South, And people don't realize how aggressive the hide, the hair, the dirt, and everything that's on their hide is on a knife blade. And myself and a couple of other knife makers uh, were eradicating some hogs at one time. And I think we ended up shooting 21 in a day. And we had a variety of our knives laid out there so we could test all of them out. And all of the meat we donated to families in need. But we tested, I don't know, 12 or 14 knives that day. And it's amazing what you can learn when you're actually using it versus just theory.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. Uh, that's a lot. That's a lot of hog. I mean, I think in one time maybe I've cleaned like four, but to go through that many hog, you really, I mean, I don't know a single knife that would withstand 20 some hog because I mean I agree their hides everyone's a little bit different. I've hunted hog in a lot of different seasons and you know sow and boar, and it seems like the texture of the skin and the hair and what they've been in with you know whether they're wallowing and stuff all seems to affect the way that you address cleaning it. um, and I'm always interested in field testing things, but I don't hunt as much as I used to. So it's kind of difficult. So I'm always looking for customer feedback too, because I mean, reality is that if I have a knife that doesn't perform well in the field, because you know I have made it theoretically instead of practically, then I'm usually like that. Well, that's kind of like a warranty job or something. Like, let me fix that and do something a little bit different. But it's that continuous feedback loop that I think is really important in craftsmanship because you really do. You get a worldview of your design principles and blade geometry and things like that um, from other people as well, and I find that more beneficial than if I just try to make knives in a vacuum.
Absolutely. The feedback, we have to be honest with ourselves as makers too. We do make mistakes. What seems like a good idea on paper and what looks good on a knife in the field may be a terrible idea. And if we can't get out there to use it, we need that feedback from our customers. And like I said, we just have to be honest with ourselves. Okay, it seemed like a good idea, but it didn't turn out that way. Uh, Everybody's always pursuing the next best thing, some great blade pattern or shape or whatever it might be. And there's a finite number of things that we can do with a piece of steel. So putting it all together as a total package, uh, heat treat, geometry, materials, uh, and then getting that feedback, it's really important. If you're not pursuing that feedback, I mean, you're doing your customers a disservice.
Yeah. So what when you started making knives, were you doing stock removal or bladesmithing, or kind of like what was your idea of the what worked best for you starting out?
Originally, like I said, it was just buying pre-made blanks and putting the handles on. So I was building a knife, but not actually making it. From there, I met a gentleman known very well in this area by the name of George Engelbretson, and he's since passed away quite a few years ago. But uh, he was kind of a grumpy old man, and I would go to his shop and just bug the crap out of him, and he would let me do some things, and that progressed. It was just stock removal. That's all he did. He was a stock removal guy. He didn't believe in what he called wamping. He said that's too much work, and I'm just not going to do it. So he didn't do any forging. If he wanted Damascus, he had one particular maker that he bought his Damascus billets from. And so he was teaching me stock removal methods and handle assembly and fit and finish. And I walked into his shop one day and he threw me out. And at first I thought he was joking, uh, but he was adamant. Just get out. Just leave my shop. Don't come back. And I was like, okay, what did I do? He said, if you're not going to get serious about this and go buy your own grinder and get your own tools and start doing this, then stop wasting my time. And so I left. I went home and I ordered a Bader grinder. And I mean, they're still very expensive, but at the time it was a significant investment for me. And I came back and I showed him the order form that I'd sit off. And he said, all right, get your apron. Let's get busy. And he put me back to work. And that was just the way he was. He was just a grumpy old guy, and he is very sorely missed. From there, I started meeting other makers and visiting their shop. And there used to be a group called the Old Man Group. That's what I named them. Every day they'd meet for coffee, and I'd go by as often as I could. And through that group, I met other makers in this area. Another maker from Oklahoma named Mike Miller was moving and asked me to come out and help him move some of his equipment and load it up. And so I went out and we were loading everything. And he said, do you see the forge over there? I said, yeah. He said, put that in your truck because I'm not doing that anymore. That's too much work. I said, okay, great. So I loaded up his forge and brought it back to the house and had never attempted to forge at all. I learned very quickly that it's more than just hitting a piece of metal. There's a lot of nuance, and I would have benefited greatly by attending one of the schools that are now available, or hammer-ins. There's so much more instructional opportunity than there was 20 years ago, or even 10 or 15 years ago. And I can remember the first time I tried doing Damascus, or the period where I was trying to. I just assumed if it's not sticking, you just have to hit it harder. Well, that's not how that works. There's a lot more to it than that. And that progressed, and I've told this story before. One of my first knife shows was the Central States Hammer-In, which started with Gary Mulkey in Branson, Missouri. And it was at Shepherd of the Hills, and I was set up next to Lynn Ray while he was still a journeyman smith. And Brian Tomberlin, who's one of the ABS board members now, came up to me and he said, hey, would you like to come down and forge some knives with me and some of the other guys? Well, I mean, of course I'm going to say yes. Who's going to turn that opportunity down? And for anyone not familiar with Shepherd of the Hills, it's an amusement park in Branson, which is a entertainment type city or town. And so he walked off, and a few minutes later, they announce over the loudspeaker of the park that I'm about to be doing a forging demonstration for anyone that would like to come watch me. I had no idea what I was doing, and they had set me up and thought it was hilarious. And I showed up down there. It's like, guys, I don't know what I'm doing. And one of them said, that's all right. They don't either. He said, just follow what we do. And so Brian would narrate for me and tell the crowd, okay, I don't know what Shawn's going to do next, but here's what I would do. And I would tell him, yeah, that's exactly what I was planning to do, and just follow his instructions. And that was my first public forging. And then continually progressed until I did Forged in Fire on kind of a bet with my son. And it's just continued to grow, and the opportunities have grown. I've been so fortunate to meet so many people that have helped me. The whole community is just awesome.
Yeah, and with your Forged in Fire experience, if I recollect, you actually won Forged in Fire, correct?
I did. I was fortunate enough to win my episode. Yes.
So I mean, it's interesting, the trial by fire, and in the sense of blacksmithing and everything that you've gone through. Sometimes I think that we hate resiliency and having to adapt, but in some ways it is one of the best methods for learning, because we have to very quickly get out of our comfort zone if we want to swim versus sink.
Yeah. It's Forged in Fire for me was that outside my comfort zone quite a bit. I'm retired law enforcement, so I tell people I spent my entire career trying to stay off of camera, stay off of the news, and then to go on a television show where there are cameras literally everywhere around you was dramatically different for me. But my son I think he was getting a B in one of his classes, and he asked me, he said, if I can bring that up to an A, will you apply for the show? And of course I agreed, because I assumed I would never even be considered for the show, and then ended up going on the show. And it was a fun experience, but I remember uh, one particular part during the filming where I had a warp in my blade, and one of the cameramen comes sliding in on his knees, trying to get a shot from the end of my knife blade, and I kept moving my blade about 4 inches one way, and he would move over, and I move it back 4 inches the other way. I didn't want him to see how warped it was, and trying to hide it from him. But they've got cameras everywhere, and so they catch everything. But the whole experience was great. I still keep in touch with the other guys that were on my episode. Um, I see the judges periodically at different events and get to talk to them. So it's been a great experience for me.
Yeah, I mean, from the outside looking in to the Forged in Fire culture and everything. There's obviously two ways that I look at it. One is that Forged in Fire has been really great for the knife making community because it's proliferated a lot of everything that we just didn't have before. Like I mean, there's more manufacturers of forged goods. There's more anvil availability in some ways. There's more knowledge sharing and everything like that. But then there's also this saturation of the market because it's made something that was kind of fringe seem really cool, and now it's like artisanal and everybody wants to do it. Um, what what do you think that the aftermath of Fortune and Fire is like? When you went on there, obviously you won. Um, what did the after look like? Did you notice that there was like increased orders or attention or validation that's come out of that experience for you?
I think a lot of it is what you make of it. Everyone that watches the show and everyone's a fan of the show. I still enjoy everything about it, but at the end of the day, it's a game show. There are a lot of incredible artists, craftsmen that go on the show and don't do well in the competition. And there are a lot that aren't as good that end up winning. Winning or losing is not a good gauge of someone's competence level as a knife maker. Uh, it's a game show, but it's for fun. If you're watching Forge and Fire to learn how to make knives, you really need to progress beyond that and look at other avenues. Watch it for entertainment. There are some things to be learned from it, but it's an entertainment venue. After winning, uh, there was a lot of recognition of that. I was in season 5, and I think they're in season 10 or 11 now. So there's a lot of people that have been on the show now compared to then. And I was even out of state once and was recognized as having been on the show. So it's a very popular entertainment. Uh, I can remember right after I went on and it was announced and everything, and my show aired, I had a banner that I helped put up behind my table at shows. A little while later, I made a little sign that I hung off the front of my table. A little while after that, I had a little 8x10 sign that I put on the table. And it's progressively gotten smaller and smaller because as much as I enjoyed the show and I've enjoyed everything that happened from it, I'd like to be known for what I make and not being on an entertainment show. Uh, you're very, very right that the show is brought it into the mainstream and has saturated the market. Uh, some ways good, some ways bad. It's a very controversial thing amongst a lot of makers. A lot of the older makers are not fond of it, but we wouldn't have this younger generation doing it now if it weren't for the popularity of the show. So if we want this to continue and grow, I think it's been a very, very good thing.
Yeah, it's kind of like that quote. It was the best of times. It was the worst of times. I, yeah, I don't know. I mean, I get kind of crotchety about things like that, and I don't know whether it's like I think like the late Gen Xer type of culture backwards tends to be hipsters in some ways. It's like we were doing that before it was cool and whatever, right?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and it's kind of easy sometimes to get into a modality where um, we either discourage or dislike people actually being excited in the stuff that we're doing. But I can think of like all these times where I've seen this happen, because I haven't been making knives like that long compared to you and compared to those who are like pre-Forged in Fire. But that wasn't the reason why I got into it. And I think most people would like for knives to be like there to be a value proposition to the custom and handmade knives, and Forge and Fire did give us that. There's a lot more attention being put on craftsmen and the quality of work. Where it's kind of interesting is um, there's a little bit of a paradigm um, where forged work is being valued higher than stock removal work. And there's kind of like this little bit of industry validation, I guess, that people value like the forged blade versus the stock removal blade. And I've always been kind of interested in that. Like, you know, I've had customers that have like come up and looked at knives or whatever it shows and things and said, well, did you forge this yourself? I'm like, no, stock removal. Put the knife down, and they walk away and find somebody that fits that criteria for them. So um, it's never really bothered me, because I know that the craftsmanship level that goes into stock removal too. But there's always a little bit of like angst on whether you're going to be competing against a forged blade or a stock removal
Certainly.
blade for those dollars.
It's a it's the old Ford versus Chevy argument, all over again. I tell people, if you want to start an argument at a knife show, find someone who forges sitting next to someone who does stock removal, and ask both of them at the same time which one is a better method. And then just step back with your popcorn and watch the drama unfold. But the way I explain it to people, every blade that I forge, that steel comes from a mill. It's been forged or rolled out at the mill before it comes to me. Then I forge it. And when I finish forging, I still go to the grinder and clean everything up. And every knife that goes through the stock removal method, that steel comes from a foundry where it was forged and rolled out. So they're both going through similar processes. Stock removal, the benefit to me is there's less opportunity to mess up the steel. Heating over and over at really high temperatures, you can damage that steel pretty significantly if you don't mitigate that after forging. Uh, the drawbacks are obviously you lose more material. You don't have the way to conserve material like you can by forging, and you're limited to the dimensions of the material that you start with. Uh, Forging, I enjoy it because I tell people it's like playing with hot Play-Doh. Anything you can do with a handful of clay or Play-Doh, you can do with hot steel. You just can't touch the steel. So you can manipulate it, move it, shape it however you want. But then I still go to the grinder afterwards. So it's kind of to me, the argument doesn't make a lot of sense. Um, I can forge out a knife, take it to the surface grinder, clean it up, grind my bevels in, and when I'm finished, you can't tell any difference between that and a stock removal knife. They would look identical. The only difference is I saved some material. Um, so it's the Ford versus Chevy argument all over to me. The bigger argument is, why should I buy your knife for this much money when I can go to Walmart and get a knife for $20? Now that one used to really upset me because I put a lot of time and effort into these blades, and for someone to compare, something that's several $100s that I've poured myself into to a $20 Walmart knife, I would kind of puff my chest up and get offended and try to argue with them about it. And then I was talking to the owner of a knife company, well-known knife company, one day, and he said, well, he compared it to cars. I prefer the museum analogy. When you go to a museum and you walk in and there's a beautiful oil painting on the wall, you can appreciate that oil painting. You know the time and effort that went into it. You look at it and you enjoy it. When you walk out of the museum, you go through the gift shop, and oftentimes they'll have a poster of that same painting. a lot of people, most people, prefer to pick up that poster, and they're happy with that poster. That's the Walmart knife. And if you're happy with the poster, by all means, go buy the poster, use it, and enjoy it. I sell the oil painting. I sell the original. That's what we as craftsmen do is we make the originals, and then places like Walmart sell the posters. Uh, and when I realized that the person wanting to buy the poster or the Walmart knife, they're not my customer. You know, what we make is a luxury item. People don't need to buy a handmade, handcrafted custom knife. They can go to Walmart or the hardware store and pick up a knife that will cut. Not as well, but if everybody wanted the top tier tools, we wouldn't have places like Harbor Freight. So once I realized that and started focusing on what I wanted to create, it took a lot of that angst out of it for me.
Yeah, and that's well put. I mean, I was thinking back to um, forge versus stock removal, and there's a lot of squabbles that happen inside of the industry that probably, if maturity and thought was abound, we probably wouldn't have those. So, like plenty of infighting. But I was talking with Lynn Ray as part of the podcast, and I haven't gotten into forge versus blacksmithing arguments because I don't know. Like for me, it doesn't really matter. But and I say it doesn't matter. I say it doesn't matter mostly that I don't personally find it offensive. But the reality is, when we choose a specific methodology, we force constraint. And that's what Lynn and I were kind of talking about inside of where he has gone with his bladesmithing, is that he creates constraints and sees if he can make something out of those things. Like, if you're, and it's the same way with Forged and Fire. I mean, they give you very specific constraints to see if that can trip you up or how adaptable you are to those things. So if it's like, roller bearings or races or spring steel or something like that, and you can only have these things, it creates drama or tension because of those constraints. Well, it really is no different when you take a step back and look at stock removal. There are some constraints, like integral bolsters inside of stock removal. The only way that I can do that is to take a much larger piece of steel and mill or stock remove down in order to get those features. And in blacksmithing, integral bolsters, as long as you understand the techniques and how to manipulate the steel, is a little bit more dynamic and intuitive process. Like you're already doing that in forging a blade. Adding a integral bolster is really just a constraint on how you move the metal versus or upset it versus having to waste a bunch in stock removal. So, like to me, I just think more about that. Like that's the reason why I don't ever stick um, religiously to stock removal, because there's some things that I'm like, bladesmithing offers me some avenues to play and to figure out things and to express myself in a medium and a constraint system that to me makes more sense to do it in blacksmithing and bladesmithing versus stock removal, if all that makes sense.
Absolutely. And Lynn is, I mean, he's at the top of the game as far as using the materials, to their full extent. And watching someone like Lynn uh, forge is a treat. If anybody gets the chance to go watch him or any other, really really good person that forges, absolutely go do it. Even if you're just into stock removal, just watching a craftsman like that who's great at what they do, it's just so much fun. And just watching some of the techniques and some of the subtleties, you can bring that back home and use it and learn from it. Uh, and you're right. I mean, but it goes both ways too. There are times in bladesmithing, forging, where you have to do more stock removal. I remember I did an integral Persian dagger a couple of years ago, and I wanted the Damascus pattern a certain way on the bolster area. And the only way to keep that, it was a full tang integral bolster with really, really deep hollow grinds. The only way to do that was stock removal. If I had tried to manipulate it, I would have changed the pattern. So I don't think you can be a knife maker and not incorporate a little bit of one or the other. If you're doing all of your own heat treating and everything, that's the reason, I don't have one single hammer. There's not one method or one way that works for everything. We just have to keep trying different things and exploring and playing with ideas. And that's one of the exciting things for me, is a little bit of a transition in topic here, but we've talked about the different generations of makers. I can remember there was a certain technique that came out several years back, and the older makers said, well, you can't do that. While looking at the end product of a new maker who had done that. And they're like, well, you can't. And it's like, but there it is. They did it. They didn't know they couldn't do it. So they just figured out a way around the problems and did it. So both generations, both the older and the newer, can learn from each other if we'll stay open-minded. There's so much new technology that 20 years ago didn't exist. We didn't have access to 3D printers to be able to do some of the mosaic Damascus that we do today. We didn't have access to the EDM systems that they do and have these elaborate little pins that the technology just blows me away. And I'm pretty naive when it comes to that kind of stuff, but I can look at something and appreciate it for what it is. And like I said, if you're open-minded, you can learn from almost anyone, even if you don't like their work, their style, their finish, whatever. Listen to what they have to say, and if there's nothing there, fine. But if there is, glean what you can use and take it back with you.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that. It's like if you were a disciple, or if you were a person on the mount listening to Jesus, right? Not everybody took away the same message. Not everybody went out into the world and evangelized. Not everybody heard the same thing. It's no different in any of the philosophies or teaching methods or whatever. And there are some ideas that coalesce, but others that disseminate amongst the masses and change the dynamic of how we think about things. And I I encounter the same thing in technology, where there are certain disciplines of networking or security or systems administration, or things that I've experienced in some way, shape, or form in my career, and then I'll hop into a different medium, and like the work demands that I think outside the box. And it's really easy for me to think outside the box when I don't know that there was a box to begin with. So then, things that are abstract thoughts, to me, then become very practical in some applications, because I can innovate in a space that everybody's just kind of conformed to what that norm is. And I can think a little bit outside of that, and ignorance is sometimes as powerful as like a deep knowledge. But there's I'm reminded that one of the best examples I can think of a single knife maker in this space is Steve Schwarzer. He always seems to have that childlike interest, where things are not impossible until everything's been extinguished and tried. And he's constantly embracing new technology and new methodologies. And it's been interesting, especially with the newer group of makers and Damascus and everything like that, to come in, because he can actually trade some of the caveats of like wire EDM and doing mosaics and stuff, because he's a pioneer in that area. And then 3D printing comes out. He's like, that's what we're doing next. And then gets a consortium together and starts, playing around with that and providing his fundamentals knowledge, what he used to help create that thing. and then help them to get it even further than they did conceptually before. So, I mean, I think embracing change and embracing new ways of thinking a, a step in our thought evolution that is really beneficial to all.
Absolutely. It's hard to do. We get used to doing things a certain way, using certain materials, uh, and we get comfortable. And going back a little bit to Forged in Fire, everybody was comfortable with things pre-Forged in Fire. We had our own groups. We were familiar with who was in our groups, and everybody was happy. And then Forged in Fire came along, and this whole new generation of people were exposed to what we do, and they all wanted to be a part of it. And some people thought that was great, like we said, and some people looked at it and it's like, well, you're not part of our group. You you're making this uncomfortable for me now. Uh, so yeah, we have to learn from everybody, and change is not always a bad thing. It's not always a good thing, but it's not always a bad thing. We have not just the tools and the technology, but materials. The metallurgy, the steel that we have access to, like easy access to now, that 20, 30 years ago, you had to guess, test your steels. Known sources were not, you couldn't just hop on the internet, give a supplier a call and tell them I want XYZ steel in these dimensions, and it's on your doorstep 2 days later. It's a different world, in some ways good and in some ways bad, than it used to be.
Yeah. Yeah, I kind of, well, it's forced me to rethink and reevaluate the reasons why I make knives to some extent, because I don't know if you notice this, but there are some knife makers that come onto the scene and maybe they have a few years experience, like, less than 5, and they're making some extraordinary things. And so they have the competitive, like they then automatically become competitors in finer handcrafted knives and whatnot. And then and then you also have to contend with the fact that if everybody if everybody are competitors in this space, what is it that I do, or what is it that I like, the way that I think about things that makes me different in some ways? Because sometimes we can't always compete on quality. Sometimes we can't always compete on the specific style that we make or whatever. There's always people that kind of muscle into that because of their interests, and maybe they're better in some ways. And it's made me think more about, I guess, the esoteric side of knife making, and what I derive from the craft in terms of joy and validation for my own exploration into it. And I can't say, even though I've had a little bit of angst at times, or existential crises, as it were. I think it's been good for my growth, because I've matured in a way that I don't think that I would have if I could have just been in my group and doing my things and never had that pressure.
Right. Well, if you want to grow, you have to start doing things that are uncomfortable. I think all of us started out doing a full tang knife with slab handles, and some people, that's all they do. There's nothing wrong with that at all. But if you want to progress, eventually you're going to have to do bolsters, taper the tang, do a hidden tang. Uh, One of the most frustrating parts for me is fitting up a guard to ABS standards. It. I look at a guard, and my own work is what I'm talking about. I look at a guard and I see garbage. I see every single flaw, scratch, imperfection, and another maker looks at it and looks at me like I've lost my mind because they don't see the same things I do. But different makers are at different points in their travel, in their progression through this craft. And you commented on competition. There's two ways to do things. you and I can compete against each other as makers, and I can try to win your customers over to me, and you can try to win my customers over to you, or we can collaborate with each other and come up with a better product that serves both of our customers. And that's what I would rather do. I would rather, if somebody comes to me and they want a knife that I just don't like to make, uh, I don't like doing gut hooks. I'm not a fan of how they look. They're difficult, in my opinion, to make work properly, but there are a lot of guys that enjoy making them and do a good job of it. If somebody comes to me and says, "Hey, I want this type of knife with a gut hook," you know what? I don't like doing that, but let me send you to two or three other makers I know that do. They do a good job. Now I've taken that off of my plate and I'm not making something I don't enjoy. The customer is getting exposed to new makers that they may not have known and getting a product that he wants. And those other makers are now spreading out and finding a new customer base. I tell people no is a full sentence. If somebody wants you to do something that you're not comfortable with, or you don't have the experience with, or for whatever reason you just don't want to, no, I'm sorry, I just don't do that. Starting out, I wanted to please everyone. I took commissions on knife projects that I just didn't want to do, but I also didn't want to tell anyone no. And I've been fortunate enough to progress to a point now where I can tell someone, that's just not something I'm comfortable doing for whatever reason, and hand that off to someone else. And going back to the full tang slab handle story, reminds me of something I had to be honest with myself several years ago. I was exhibiting at Blade Show in Atlanta and had worked tirelessly for weeks and weeks to have product to put on my table. And I think over the whole 3 days that we were there, I sold 2 knives and was just, absolutely crushed by the end of it. Here I've poured my heart and soul into this and I sold 2 knives. And so I kind of looked, at my work, and I had to be honest. Everything on my table, you could walk around the show and pick 2 knives off of 80% of the tables in that room, put them all on the same table, and there was no difference in them. They were all full tang slab handles, no bolsters, no guards, no tapered tangs, nothing special at all about them. And there are over 1,000 makers at that show. If everybody only brought 5 knives, that's 5,000 knives in the same room. And there's a lot more than that. So the fact that anybody chose 2 of mine out of those 5,000, I should have been very happy about. The following year, I came back. I think I had 6 or 7 knives, was all I brought. But they were knives that I wanted to make, that I enjoyed. They were my style, and they did not look like everything else in the room. And I ended up selling 3 before the doors ever opened. And I might have come home with 1 of those that week. Had my largest sale ever and had more fun because I was talking to people about something I enjoyed, not just factory work, not just pumping out numbers of knives, but pumping out things that I liked and meant something to me. So you kind of have to be honest with yourself. Shows are a hard sale. It's like selling a car at a car show. Selling a knife at a knife show it's tough. And there's a reason it's called a show and not a sale.
Yeah, I agree. I've had the same problems. Like a Blade Show Texas not too long ago. I didn't sell any knives at the show. And what's kind of weird about that, it's like it's one of the reasons why I started this podcast is to try to unveil. It's one of the reasons why I tried to unveil some of the behind the scenes stuff of knives that I've learned is that a lot of people consider not selling as a failure, and I don't really. There's lots of different ways that I look at it, but I didn't sell anything at the show and ended up selling knives after the show, like immediately after. It's because people were waiting in the wings respectfully for me to finish doing my show, and then if there was anything left, they were the ones that wanted to buy it, and like I don't think that a sale is the litmus test for success, and I've had to mature into that. I think that maybe some of that rhetoric comes from how expensive a show is. So if you sell a show, then that goes into the, well, I've recouped my loss or my investment in the show. And you kind of go through a lot of these, again, existential type of crises when you're doing stuff like that. It adds a different level of thought and determination and things in order to make things successful. Like I mean, I've tried different, like, testing out different things at shows. Like, does sitting down at your table or standing up make a difference? Does engaging every person that comes through, or allowing them just to look and peruse, does that make a difference? All these different kind of marketing and sales tactics. And after this many years of doing shows, I'm still as confused about like what actually facilitates a sale versus not. And so I've really just tried to go with whatever I have, to have fun, to engage with people. And those few people that want to sit and talk and understand more about knives, and maybe that informs their decision for the next time. I'm more than happy with that investment, rather than looking at, did this thing leave my table? Because eventually they'll all sell, in one way, shape, or form, or I'll donate some of them. Like if I have extra knives and I don't have a show coming up, I'll just donate something to a good cause. There's a few veteran organizations that will auction that knife off for far more than I could ever get on a table, and it'll go for a good cause. And for me, that's just as beneficial, to, I guess, my ego or my spirit, as it is, probably even more so than actually selling that knife at a show. I really do like donating things for good causes.
Yeah, shows are a tough deal. I think for us as craftsmen, because as I mentioned earlier, I'm not a businessman. I've had to learn to live in the business world, because if you want to stay in this market and keep doing this, you have to sell things. You can't just make everything and give it away. But there are opportunities like that, and that's a marketing strategy, is the donating, and it does make us feel better. One of the organizations that I work with quite a bit, and the Oklahoma Knife Group is pairing with this year, is the Toby Keith started a deal here in Oklahoma called the OK Kids Corral, that benefits the families of children fighting cancer. And I've been donating to that for probably 5 years or so now. And that's opened a lot of doors. I've donated some pretty significant numbers of knives that have been auctioned off, but it benefits them. It helps me. And I've gotten sales because of that. People that didn't know who I was saw those knives and contacted me. And in the same way at a show, I've seen both sides of the spectrum there. I've seen makers come in with one or two knives, and if they sell them, great. And if not, they don't care. They're just having a good time. They're seeing their friends, and they're being exposed to a customer base that wouldn't otherwise find them. Then the other side of that is, I've also watched makers who are afraid to take 10 steps away from their table because they could potentially lose a sale. And I've actually heard people tell me, I have to sell 2.5 more knives to break even, and then anything over that's profit, and then run back to their table because somebody's walking near it. And I can't do that. I'm not a salesman. I've actually told people to go look at other people's knives rather than try to sell them one of mine when they tell me what they're looking for. Again, I would much rather see all of us win than one or two come out as the big winners. I love seeing kids at knife shows. And a little bit of a tangent here. Many times I've had them come up and they're looking for a knife, and the adult with them says, yeah, he's been saving his money to buy a knife when he comes here, probably because of shows like Forged in Fire. And okay, how much have you saved up? I've saved $40. Well, we all know that $40 is not going to buy you a custom knife. But it's an incredible learning opportunity for that young person, is to take them and say, okay, what are you looking for? And here's the things you need to look for in a knife. And now I want you to go around this show, and if you find a knife that you like before you get back here, then you buy it. I would love for you to come show it to me. And if not, I want you to come back here and tell me what you learned, and ask makers these questions. And they'll come back excited. Most of the time, they obviously didn't find anything for that money. Sometimes they do. Uh, a maker will make them a deal on something. And I don't have it at every show, but occasionally I'll make a small blacksmith type knife, or a small knife, nothing fancy, and I'll keep it in my box under the table. And if that kid comes back around, I just happen to remember, by the way, I have a knife down here that's on sale for how much you saved up, and I'm able to give them a knife, and those kids will come back the next year and show you what they've done. And they'll show you either what they're collecting, what they're making, what they're doing with the knife that they got from you the previous year. And that for me is a real kick in the pants. I love that. Uh, at that same show you were talking about, Blade Show Texas, this year, I was fortunate enough to sell a few knives. And on the way home, I got to thinking about it. It wasn't a great show for me, but all of the knives I sold were to previous customers. They were people that I had a history with, a relationship with from the past. And they came to a show with hundreds of knife makers and came back to me to purchase a knife with all of that to select from. So that was cool to me. Treat your customers right, and don't be a jerk. Uh, I would much rather buy a mediocre knife from somebody I enjoy spending time with and talking to than the best knife on the market from somebody that's going to be a jerk to me. I don't want that knife. I don't care how good it is or what the price is on it, because every time I look at it, I'm going to remember talking to that person. So, treat your customers well, uh, engage with them. You can tell when they come to your table, if they don't want you talking to them, you might make a comment or two and then just leave them alone. Some people want to engage with everyone, and they have a passion for this like we do. You know, uh, it, the business side of it is a constant learning process.
Yeah. The way I got around that is I feel bad peddling knives sometimes. So I invest a little bit of money each show in having stickers and things like that that people can, go around and collect. Like my daughter loves to go table to table and get stickers, and then she puts them all over her bedroom door. And we talk about them, and some people have different designs and things like that, and that's just something that she really likes. So I was like, that's a pretty cool thing. Let me just get a few hundred stickers, and I can pass them out each day. And if I engage with people that are coming by tables, it's like, oh hey, do you want a free sticker? Like, this is totally on me. You pick it up and do what you want with it. And if knives are something that we talk about, um, as an extension of that, that's fine. But I also want people to have fun at shows. Some people, it's their first knife show. They're going to, like, especially in the blade circuit, it's a very overwhelming experience, for not just the first knife show, but really at any point in time. And if they have fun with it and they walk away saying, "Man, that was just a really great experience," then the next time a knife show comes around, they're going to be more engaged in investing their time and going and checking things out and whatnot. And I'd much rather do that with some stickers that cost me, not that much money, than try to get them roped into buying a knife. I mean, it's that, to me, that's kind of like a secondary thing, is to talk about knives if somebody is otherwise not engaged or doesn't want to be personable about picking stuff up. Because I think that there is a connotation with, if I go up to a table and I pick up a knife, then I need to buy that knife. And it's like, I want you to be able to feel different um, blade profiles and weights and things, and kind of get a feel for it. And the only way that you can really do that is by picking it up and manipulating it, and kind of, getting that tactile response and feedbacks to help you learn what you like and what you don't like.
Yeah, certainly. And there's a lot you just covered in that little bit of conversation there. treating the kids well brings them back the next year and creates an interest for them. They have good memories of that show, so they want to come back. That decal that you gave them to put on their door at home or put on their notebook or whatever, they're going to see that, and that's advertising, that's business, and it's fun, you know. And I remember another. I love stories. I love hearing them and telling them. But there's another story from Blade Show in Atlanta, an exceptionally well-known maker who sells knives in the $3,000 to $5,000 range regularly. Uh, a young boy came around and went to the table next to his, started to look at one of the knives, and that maker stopped him, told him not to touch them, and basically told him to go on. He stepped over to this other maker's table and started looking at these knives. And he answered all of his questions. The boy looked at every knife on the table, held every knife on the table, walked away, and that was the end of it. Well, towards the end of the day, that little boy came back with his father, wearing a pair of overalls, which is how I dress almost every day. Just your average looking person. He came up to the table and he told his dad, "This is the guy that I was telling you about. He has really cool stuff," and he let me look at it. And the dad thanked him and they looked over the table. And he said, "Well, which ones did you like?" And he picked out 2 or 3 that he really liked. And he, without even asking the price, he told him, "I'll take those 3 knives. You're the only person that talked to him, engaged with him, and let him look at your work." And I don't know the total cost of those 3 knives combined, but it was well into the 4, possibly 5 figures. I don't know. So treat everyone well. You don't know where that decal is going to end up, who's going to see it. At a big show like that, somebody may not even know you're there, but they may have heard your name. And when they see that decal on somebody's t-shirt, oh, that person's here, I'm going to go find them. They may have had a good interaction with you in the past and they come back to you. So all of those things, they make a difference. And people can tell when you're there as a salesman or you're there as a craftsman. That it's just like buying a car. When you walk in, you get that used car salesman vibe from somebody. And I would rather talk to you about knives and teach you about knives and have you come back to me later than push a sale on somebody that doesn't really want or need what I'm providing.
Yeah. Well, and I think it's about the investment that we make with our life energy. And, it like, whether you want to like pull religious references or things like that, being a good Samaritan, treating others as you would have them treat you. Uh, to me, I, I think a lot about um, more than just monetary widgets, right? Like I have my life energy in the knives that I make, and I want them to go to people who appreciate that sacrifice or that investment that I've made. And in the same way, if I spend 50 cents on a sticker, well, I mean, I paid for that, but there's a like working as a full time technology guy, in cybersecurity and whatnot. I have the blessing of being able to take one form of hard work and energy and turning that into a benefit in another area. And stickers and things like that, or maybe more cost effective knives that I can give away to kids. Those are ways that, I mean, in some ways I can either like witness or just show a good example of like what should be the quality of a person. Like always be humble, be kind, and treat others as you would be treated. And if you stick to those core tenets, I think that like the world is a much better and more exciting place.
It's a lot more fun being friends with people than being enemies. You know, it, what you're saying there. I mean, how many kids have you given a sticker to and just they're genuinely happy over that 50-cent sticker that you gave them? And I just don't want to be a salesman. I want to have fun doing this. I use the word fortunate a lot. I've been extremely fortunate that I had a good career. I have a retirement coming in. I don't have to sell a knife to keep the lights on. So I do understand there's different pressure based on, why you do this. If you do it as a hobby, if you do it full time to feed your family, or like me, it is a business, but I don't consider myself a businessman. Uh, it's just opened so many doors for me that I'm very, very fortunate, and I know that, and I owe that to a lot of people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I they well, they say in fishing, right? Like a bad day fishing is better than the best day working. And I'm kind of a similar mind when it comes to knife making. Like a bad day knife making is better than the best day working for somebody else, and to just you know uh, get the whip cracked at you to get some widgets done. And there's a more it's a difference between going out and hunting and taking your own game and cooking it, and the satisfaction you feel because, like, soup to nuts, you've been an integral part of that entire process versus just going out and buying something and then getting a bellyache later on because it wasn't prepared right or whatever. There's an entire um, internal validation process and joy that you derive from making and whatnot. And I think every day I get to make knives and to do this fun stuff is a blessing to me. It also helps that I enjoy my day job. But that is the balance too. I've spent tens of thousands of dollars on knife shows, and sometimes when those shows don't really equal the business being able to pay itself back, I have to evaluate, could I have spent $10,000 on, 3 shows, everything combined, travel and whatnot, or could I have taken my family on a really great vacation? And I think that there is a balance. Everything that you like is not always good for you. I mean, heroin addicts and stuff like that can attest. And we have to look at the difference between addiction and joy and validation with anything that we do, and make sure that we balance things out appropriately. But with all that being said, if I take a little bit of a financial hit and I can go and do these things and bring a little bit of light to other people's lives and make this this engine or this vehicle that we have in knives um, grow and be beneficial to others, to me that's worth it, and it feels really good. Like anything that feels really good to me, that feels wholesome and whatnot, those are the things I want to do more of, and I've found a lot of that inside of knives and our craft.
Yeah, that there's definitely value beyond the dollar signs that you get for a knife. Uh, the relationships that you make, um, being able to create, uh, it feeds me. Um, I know, like when I go on vacation, if I don't have a notebook with me, I almost go crazy. I have to be able to sketch ideas. If I'm not able to get to my shop, I need some way to remember what I was thinking about. Uh, so yeah, there's a lot more to all of this than just selling a product. I can go down to 7-Eleven and work as a clerk and sell a product. Uh, we are, not to use the term loosely, but we are artists and craftsmen, and we enjoy that part of it. The creative side of it, really, no matter how involved you are in it, you get to create something and make something, and it's fun. So it's, you were talking about this industry and how we grow and feed, and uh, that's, I've, over the last few years, I've watched a lot of younger makers coming in, and a lot of the older makers that have gotten to a point where they've had to either slow down significantly or even stop making, because of age, illness, variety of reasons, and trying to bridge the gap between those two, uh, so the new makers can gain knowledge from those older guys that are on their way out. I mean, that sounds a little heavy, I guess, but honestly, there's a whole generation of makers that we're losing to age. They're not able to make it to the shows. They're not able to put on classes like they used to. Uh, and these new makers jump on YouTube and start just gorging themselves on the information there. Well, some of that's good and some of it's not. Just because somebody has a cell phone does not mean they should be teaching. And anybody with a cell phone can create a YouTube channel and preach the gospel of knife making, but they may not be preaching the word. So trying to connect the younger generation to the older generation these last few years has been kind of what I've been trying to do and figure out how to do that. And it's not always easy.
Yeah. I think that's a perfect segue to talk a little bit about the Oklahoma Knife Group. Now, I've been a member. This is my second year now. I went to the more recent show after, I guess, the name change and whatnot. But to be honest with you, I don't know a lot about the legacy of the Oklahoma Knife Group and kind of how everything started. And I would, in lieu of the Oklahoma Knife Group having a website and kind of showing that legacy, I'd really like to hear it from the horse's mouth, somebody who knows more about it as a board member and everything. And could you kind of go into a little bit more detail about like the origins and kind of the purpose behind the group?
Absolutely. I mean, I love talking about knives, and I love talking about our knives in this region. So the Oklahoma Knife Group, what's known as the Oklahoma Knife Group now, used to be the KGA, the Knife Group Association. Unfortunately, or fortunately, whichever way you want to look at it, KGA was created about 23 years ago, I believe, and had graphics made up, a symbol, the knife group, and it was created by guys like Mike Miller, Ray Kirk, George Engelbretson, some great makers, Jerry McClure, guys here in Oklahoma who are passionate about what they do. So they created the Oklahoma Knife Group, and about twice a year they would do a shop tour where they would go to someone's home, go to their shop, and have little breakout classes, have lunch, raffle a few things off to make money to pay for the food and things like that. Fairly informal group, and sit around, drink tea, and lie to each other all day, and just have a good time and share ideas and knowledge. Well, 23 years ago, the internet wasn't what it is today. You couldn't get online and find everybody in your town that is interested in knives. So it was more of a word of mouth. About 2 years ago, we were at a shop tour here at my house, and I got the board members together on the back porch during lunch, and I said, hey, what would you think about rebranding the group and trying to freshen it up and get some younger blood into the board? And I was honestly pretty hesitant to broach the subject because I was afraid I would offend them. And I've got massive respect for these guys. That was the last thing I ever wanted to do. And a little bit to my surprise, they got excited about it. And we kind of ran with it. So if you Google KGA, it came back as the Kansas Golf Association. So to counter that, we just simplified it to Oklahoma Knife Group. And it's open to makers, collectors, enthusiasts. If you just enjoy knives, that's what we're about. We still try to do 1 or 2 shop tours a year and our annual show. Well, 2 years ago, the show was pretty small. In 2023, it really blew up. If you were at that show, we had huge crowds, which was good and bad. The venue, H&H Shooting Sports in Oklahoma City, treated us exceptionally well. Unfortunately, the space, we just outgrew it. So in 2023, I believe we had 64 tables that we were able to sell. For 2024, we moved it to Norman, Oklahoma, to the Cleveland County Fairgrounds. We have an entire building, and we have 134 tables and still have a waiting list of people wanting in. We currently have makers signed up to exhibit from as far away as the country of Georgia in Europe, which just really shocked us. We had no idea that anybody, from that far away even knew he existed. So there's a lot of excitement, a lot of new makers, young makers that see the benefit of community here. And the guys that, like Mike Miller was the president of the KGA for 22 years. That's a long time to be in charge of anything. And they're getting on up in years. They're getting tired. And I know I don't want to be on the board for 22 years. A few years down the road, I expect to pass the baton to someone else who's excited and wants to keep this going. We are an LLC. We're not in this to make money. We're in this to build up the makers and get them exposed to buyers and to further the craft. If you're a member of the if you're a member of the OKG, then you have access to classes throughout the year that we do, little breakout classes on. I think Brian Tomberlin did one recently on knife design and grinding, I believe. I wasn't able to attend. It was limited to about 10 people or so. All it cost our members was the cost of the class, whatever it cost us in materials to put it on, which was very, very minimal. You can't take a class from an ABS Mastersmith for 8 hours for 20, 30 bucks, whatever it costs, anywhere in the country. It's just not a thing. We have another class coming up on folders. Bill Kennedy is doing that one. He's a fantastic maker. To be able to go to his shop, see his tools, ask him questions in a setting of maybe 10 people total for $20, $25, whatever the cost is, that's a big deal. The show this year has just grown a lot. It'll be April 27th down in Norman. I hope everybody can make it. I'm doing everything I can. Our board is working incredibly hard to market this, to get buyers in the door. We have volunteers that are working hard. I think I mentioned earlier that I've worked with the Oklahoma Kids Corral and Toby Keith's Foundation. They will actually be on site that day managing a silent auction for some knives that were donated to their cause. If you're interested in those, go talk to them, take a look at the knives. Even if you're not interested in making a bid, take a look at what they do. And it's a very worthwhile cause. So, the group just needed to be brought into, I hate to say modern times, but updated and refreshed. And last fall, I believe it was, Mike Miller stepped down as president. The board voted me in as president and Brian as vice president. That was never my intention. I had no desire to be president. I just wanted to see the group grow, and we definitely have. And we have some other exciting things coming for our members in the next few months, hopefully, to keep people coming back. I just want to see people in Oklahoma and this region get together and build each other up.
Yeah. Yeah, because I think, we have the Texas Knife Makers Guild here in Texas, but there's usually a lot of distance that separates us because of how big the state is. And, a lot of knife makers kind of centralized around like the populated areas. But through the Texas Knife Makers Guild, I've noticed that there's more people that are close to me than I ever thought. And in the same way, I had heard of people talking about the 2020, I guess the 2022 show for the Oklahoma Knife Group, and that it was fairly small. And there's some knife makers that look at show size as to whether it'll be viable or not, if they're going to sell knives and whatnot and get exposure. And last year when we were at the show, like once in a while, I'm divorced and have a child with my ex-wife, and once in a while, Sissy will get to go to shows with us, and she loved it. She met Jim and Dolly, and Dunlap, and she absolutely loved them. We sat right next to them, and uh, like her experience with that show was phenomenal, and it was in a small enough setting, I think, with the tables that. She was able to go around and look at material. She every show that she gets to, she goes to Jant's and buys handle material, something for her little collection on her shelf. And once in a while, she tries to convince me to make a knife for her, but she's a little bit unwieldy with blades, so we're kind of waiting on that. But she has a lot of handle material to choose from. Whenever she gets to that place, I could probably make her knives for years, and she's a good collector of handle material. But yeah, like the venue was a little bit small, but the energy was really great. I mean, I talked to so many people. It was close enough in proximity where we appreciate the day show, because we can just drive up there, do the show, and don't have to worry about the hotel accommodations for a long period of time. And even like if it was a 2-day show eventually, I don't think that would matter too much to us because it is close. But what I guess, like, the point is, I really, through the Oklahoma Knife Group, have gotten a better scope of the Oklahoma culture in knife making, and getting to see more of the participation from Oklahoma knife makers in a way that I just don't know if I would have been able to if I had to look at individual makers that are kind of posting up on each group and then tracing them back to their state. Even though we have a lot of other a lot of other border states to Oklahoma participating in the show, I think it's been really good to see just the quality of work and the enthusiasm in Oklahoma for the craft, and everybody has been super nice. Like, it's just a really focused bunch of really great people, and I think that's what I like even more than the knives, is just how good the people are.
That's all. I love hearing that, and getting that perspective from a little bit outside my own personal little circle. Uh, it's great to hear that what we're doing is working. And I think, Texas, Oklahoma, each state, you have pride in your state. And it's amazing to me how much talent we have around that we don't realize until we come to something like that. Uh, and this show, uh, it, it has grown exponentially over the last few years. I actually, this morning, visited a possible new venue for the 2025 show. So that's how far out we're looking and working on making this show even better than it will be next month. Uh, the volunteers, the board members are awesome. I can't say enough good about them. Uh, People just don't realize how many hours a day go into making an organization like the Oklahoma Knife Group or the Texas Knife Makers Guild, making that work. And you're right, we do have somewhat of a benefit here in Oklahoma that geographically we're not nearly as separated as makers are in Texas. If if you're not familiar with Texas, it's hard to explain that you could drive all day and never leave the state, in one direction. Uh, so yeah, we all need to take pride in what we do and the people around us that do that. So, and you mentioned meeting other makers close to you at that show. Uh, to me, that's one of the big, huge benefits of doing shows is meeting other makers that you wouldn't be exposed to. Uh, I've had the opportunity to exhibit in Atlanta, in Fort Worth, all around the central U.S. And because of the people I met at those shows, I've also had the opportunity to exhibit overseas. And talking about regional things, it's interesting to me to see the design elements, the way things are laid out, and what people in different regions prefer. Uh, it's not as obvious to go from Oklahoma City to Fort Worth, but you go from Oklahoma City to Europe and look at the knife designs and patterns and what's popular. And it really is different by region, like significantly different.
Yeah, and speaking of that, I did want to talk a little bit about your sheath style in your knives. Like I've always been attracted to pioneer style knives, which I mean, not all of your knives fit into that category per se, but I do gravitate towards some of those knives that do look more. Um, like early Bowie esque, pioneer style knives, and the sheath style is reminiscent of John Cohey, who passed last year, I guess it was last year, or the year before. And is there any influence that you have from him on your sheath making, or how
Oh,
exactly?
absolutely.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
continue. I won't interrupt you. That's
No,
full stop.
no,
That's the question.
John uh, was a huge influence on me. And like you, I've been attracted to that style. I call it frontier style. Um, I'm not Native American. I don't call it, Indian, Native American, mountain man, whatever. To me, it's something that you could possibly have seen on the American frontier, early to mid 1800s. Uh, Before Facebook and just instant messaging and stuff, I saw John's work printed somewhere, and I can't remember where. I found his email address, and I sent him an email with a question about something. And just a few minutes later, I got an email back, and all it had was his phone number. No answer to my question or nothing. And I was a little bit hesitant to call because it's like, well, this is either going to go really well or he's mad at me about something. I called him, and I think we stayed on the phone for over 2 hours talking. And I loved him to death. He a little bit abrasive on the surface, but just a great guy with a huge heart, and answered any question I ever had. If I had a question, I could email him, text him, the phone would ring, and we'd sit and talk forever, and he'd answer those questions for me. Before John, Daniel Winkler and Karen Shuk kind of did something similar. Um, I think John kind of took that and ran with it, and Daniel Winkler went a different direction with his work. Um, it's just a very different style, uh, and kind of evokes some imagery in my mind when I hold it and when I'm working with it that I don't get from just a standard knife with a vegetable tan leather sheath. And for anyone not familiar with the style we're talking about, it's rawhide, uh, lacing, fur, claws, ermine tail, big conchos, something that you could imagine in that wild frontier age. Uh, and John was just a huge influence on me. And I talked to him, just before he passed, and he was excited that part of his legacy was that people would still be making that style of knife using his techniques. So he was very, very happy about that. Um, the DVDs that he made are still available, and uh, it's a great series for anybody interested can look those up. But he goes into great detail on that. The difference working rawhide versus vegetable tan is I can go out and cut the parts out for a vegetable tan sheath, work on it for a little while, leave it for a day or two, come back, work on it for a while, leave it for a few hours, come back, and just do it when I want to. When you're working with rawhide, once you wet that rawhide, you have to finish it. You can't work it for a little while and come back because it gets so hard, and the techniques are different. And there's a bit of a learning curve with it because the rawhide stretches when it's wet, it shrinks when it's dry. So if it fits well when it's wet, you're not going to be able to get your knife in that sheath when it's dry. And some of that knowing what to do with it just comes from playing with it for a while. And going back to the creative aspect of what we do, that style of sheath allows me so much creative freedom over a simple vegetable tan sheath. Uh, Not that there are not guys that do veg tan that are just incredible artists. For me, the rawhide just allows a different kind of outlet. And John and Daniel and Karen Shook, I look up to them immensely and refer back to their work a lot, for ideas and inspiration.
Yeah. For anybody who's not aware, Chris Crawford and I had founded this podcast together, and he went on to do other things. And John and Chris had done one, two, three, four videos related to uh, frontier style sheaths and blades, and I think it's worth anybody going and actually looking at that. But you know,
Absolutely.
the thing that I think about with rawhide too is that we have we have in knives like this kind of paradigm between the perfect and the imperfect, where you're either pushing for perfection or you're embracing imperfection, and it's kind of a weird, again, kind of existential decision that you make sometimes. And what I really like about John's style, and well, even in this frontiersman style of sheath and knife making, is that um, imperfections are embraced because it's a product of the time, right? And we've gotten away from that, where people want Sheffield style knives, where it's like, honed, and there's craftsmen of multiple generations doing those same things and getting it to what is like functional perfection. And then you have, frontier knives that are sometimes a little bit rough around the edges. To me, frontier is Americana, right? It is it is this
Mhm.
window into a lifestyle and an aesthetic that is 100% utility. It is 100% making your own things for your own purposes, and in that, I find a lot of beauty. There's a lot to look at. There's a lot to study, and like I love your knives because when I do look at those, that's evocative to me. I really just sit and think about what it took to make that, and they're wonderful collection pieces because you can constantly go back to it and just admire it. So I mean, you're doing a wonderful job in keeping that legacy alive, and applying your own eye and everything to it as well.
Thank you. I really do love everything about it, and I want to give you know consideration to guys like John, and I also don't want people thinking I'm trying to copy his work. That style is what I like. John had a way of like you said, incorporating uh, new and clean with the imperfections. Uh, I actually had the privilege of working on the last knife, or finishing the last knife that John worked on. It was a commission piece, and he passed before it was finished. Somehow my name got brought up into it, and I was able to finish grinding the blade for him, heat treat it, put the guard and handle assembly all together. Had some just absolutely stunning scrimshaw uh, by an artist named Charles Connors. Um, and it ended up with the collector, who was very happy with it. For me, it was just an honor to get to finish that knife and be a part of that collaboration. Um, I think my knives are slightly different from John's. I think maybe a little more finished and a little less of the forge marks left on it, though. A lot of people, like you talked about earlier, I think before we started recording, was or it may have been after we started, about some people want that forged knife. They want proof that it was forged. So occasionally I'll actually leave a forge mark in it, leave a little bit of scale on the spine, um, and that appeals to a certain crowd. Some people don't want that, and to all of the people that tell me I do or don't like XYZ, I reply that if everyone wanted the same knife, I'd find a different hobby, because I don't want to make the same knife every time. So variety is fun. Uh, Sometimes I make a knife that is very crude looking, but I still want good quality, um, but has that frontier aged, used look to it. I think there's a bit of a misconception uh, about rustic versus rough. A knife can be rustic looking and still have very good fit and finish. versus just roughly put together and unfinished. If you look back at historical reference knives, they were not put together in a shoddy manner. They took pride in their work. I can remember I was at a museum in Paris a couple of years ago, and I, my son was a little bit embarrassed, but I was on my hands and knees with my flashlight looking at some Cinque Deas that they had in there, and just absolutely floored me at the detail and aspects that they put into those knives that are centuries old. They didn't have power tools. This was all hand fitted, and there were no gaps, there were no seams, and this is hundreds of years after it was made. And today we have people who are using the excuse of oh, that's the way it would have looked, or it's rough, or brute de forge. No, brute de forge doesn't mean rough and poorly assembled. That just means that you leave some of your forging marks. You still need to work on cleaning things up and making things straight and doing it right. You can still have some of that brute de forge look, but I may be stepping on some toes here, but it goes back to honestly assessing your work. Am I doing stuff that's just good enough, or am I doing good work?
Well, I totally agree. I mean, even like going back to conversations about Sheffield, those knives, regardless of whether they were pocket knives or whether they were fixed blade, all started in a forge, and they're exemplary in their quality and fit and finish and everything. But they started much the same way, and it really does cause you to think about what is achievable and what your good enough is. I've talked about that because in the concepts of like the Knife Makers Guild, they're like the last 10% is like 90%. Um, and pushing for that extra fit and finish and everything is something that you have to articulate and be willing to push yourself to get into. And I'm reminded of carpentry. And you look at like a Victorian era chest of drawers, or really anything from that era, and maybe you have like a French polish on the outside, but if you look behind every drawer, in every construction, you see perfect dovetailed joinery, and uh, like everything is joined and finished in the areas where you can't see them very easily. You have to look. And I think that's something about quality of craftsmanship that's important to know, is that it's not even so much about where everybody sees where quality should be paid attention to, but it's in those areas where nobody would look to see. Like, I mean, how are you finishing inner frames, or is your guard fit up good? Are you hiding it with solder? There's a plethora of areas where if you're looking at the areas where nobody else is, and your craftsmanship is good there, then the aesthetic of the piece is something that you can use for like to be evocative. But it all starts with fundamentals of understanding construction, understanding good fit and finish, understanding durability, and those pieces, could outlast several generations and be in museums one day. But if you make it poorly, or you settle with you settle for less because that helps to confirm a bias that quality is not important, or this is how you get to that rustic look. Well, we have the same problem with knives that are coming out of Pakistan. They're not durable knives. They're not made well. They may look good and comparative to hand forged Damascus and everything, look similar. But in performance and in longevity, they're just not the same things. And we have to understand that balance in order to be able to produce something that we can be proud of. And it doesn't matter whether we step on the toes of that propriety. People need to understand that in order to continue to push our craft in an area of quality to make the value proposition between production versus handmade there and visible and known by people. You have to be willing to produce more than just crap that's not going to last very long. Like we're not making IKEA knives, we're not making Walmart knives. We're making something that's supposed to stand the test of time, and that comes from a fundamental understanding of construction and of fit and finish.
Absolutely. It's, that attention to detail is a matter of pride. Um, Going back to John Cohey, one of the things that he always did was during the sheath making, he would dye the inside of the sheath, and nobody sees that. But to John, that was a big deal because if you don't dye it, then it doesn't match, regardless of whether anybody sees it or not. And it's the parts that people don't see that make a knife better or worse. The construction, the materials that you use, the adhesives, the heat treat on the steel. I actually had a maker tell me one time that he doesn't even heat treat Damascus blades, which just shocked me. I asked him why, and he said, well, nobody's ever going to use them, so I'm not going to waste my time. That just blew me away. But it's the heat treat, using the right steels, and being honest with your customer base that, if I use a reclaimed steel or recycled steel, occasionally I'll use a rasp, Farrier's rasp, or I've had people bring me a piece of steel from their farm, a family car or something like that. I have to be honest with them. I can't dial this in the way I can if I have a known steel. And as long as they understand that, I'm fine with it. But I'm not going to present that as a finished piece from me that I would put on my table for sale without disclosing that. You have to take pride in what you do, and if you don't, it either shows or it will reveal itself eventually somehow.
Yep. Yeah, I like everybody should be making knives that are prepared for the zombie apocalypse, right? I mean, because you have this big show knife and it's sitting up on the shelf, and then somebody comes in and tries to use that to save themselves against a zombie horde. Except the blade bends in half, and you're like, oh no, and then you get eaten by
Right.
zombies. Well, if if you're making that like the 400-year-old katana, or like the knife that is perfect in its functionality and it saves somebody's life, you cannot prepare for how your things are going to be used in the future. And I always prepare for the worst case scenario. So if I look
Mm-hmm.
at that from a construction and quality perspective, one day down the road, in a context that we're not prepared for, that might be the difference between life or death for somebody.
Well,
It's a thought.
we make functional art. The first word is functional. If it doesn't perform the function it was designed to, then it's just art, and you can just draw that. And not to take away from people that do drawing or painting, but why go through all the trouble of forging it out if it's not going to function and do its intended purpose? The Bowie knives that I make, I've had people, well, I'm never going to cut anything with this. It's like, well, that's fine. That's your choice. If you buy it, it's yours to do what you want with. But they were made to use, or to at least be functional in the field, the use that they're intended for. If it's a skinning knife, I actually had a customer call me a couple of years ago, ecstatic because he used a Damascus knife to skin and clean a deer. And he said, yeah, I was kind of upset because I forgot my regular skinner that I got from you, and this was the only one I had with me, and it worked just as well. I said, well, what did you think it was going to do? He goes, well, it's Damascus. I thought they were just to look at. It's like, no, if, it's a knife, use it like a knife. That's what they're for. Enjoy them. It goes back to the same thing. Eat dessert first. Use the good china. Open the good bottle of wine. Enjoy life. So if it comes out of my shop and it's made to be a knife, that's what it can be used for.
Well, I totally agree. I can't agree more on that. I think that it shows up in your work and your personability with others and things like that. And it's been really great to get you on the podcast and talk to you about everything. Obviously we share this common interest in the Oklahoma Knife Group, but I've followed your work for a long time, and I've always admired it. And you've always been very, very kind, especially what I've seen in your online representation in the community and whatnot. So, Shawn, it's a pleasure to have you on the show and to get some time and just talk about you and your values and your art. And I'm honored.
It's been an absolute pleasure, and I can talk knives all day long. It's an absolute passion of mine. So thank you very much for having me on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for listening to another episode of the Good Old Blades podcast. Remember that you are loved, and God bless.